Section 9 of The Psychology of Peoples by Gustave Le Bon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Oxenhandler. Book 3. The History of Peoples Considered as a Consequence of Their Character. Chapter 1. How the Soul of Peoples is Responsible for Their Institutions. The history of a people is always determined by its mental constitution. Various examples how the political institutions of France are the outcome of the soul of the race, their real invariability beneath their apparent variability. Our most different political parties pursue identical political ends under different names. Their ideal is always centralization and the destruction of individual initiative to the profit of the state. How the French Revolution merely executed the program of the old monarchy. Contrast between the ideal of the Anglo-Saxon race and the Latin ideal. The initiative of the citizen substituted for the initiative of the state. People's institutions are always the outcome of their character. History, in its main lines, may be regarded as the mere statement of the results engendered by the psychological constitution of races. It is determined by this constitution, just as the respiratory organs of fish are determined by their aquatic life. In the absence of a preliminary knowledge of the mental constitution of a people, its history appears a chaos of events governed by hazard. On the contrary, when we are acquainted with the soul of a people, its life is seen to be the regular and inevitable consequence of its psychological characteristics. In all the manifestations of the life of a people, we always find the unchangeable soul of the race weaving itself its own destiny. It is more especially in political institutions that the sovereign power of the soul of the race manifests itself the most visibly. It will be easy for us to prove this statement by a few examples. Let us, to start with, take France, that is, one of the countries of the world which has been subjected to the most profound upheavals, a country in which in a few years the political institutions seem to have changed most radically, in which the parties seem the most divergent. If we consider from the psychological point of view these apparently so dissimilar opinions, these perpetually struggling parties, we note that they possess in reality a perfectly identical common substratum which exactly represents the ideal of our race. Intransigents, radicals, monarchists, socialists, in a word all the champions of the most diverse doctrines, pursue, though they give themselves different names, an absolutely identical end, the absorption of the individual by the state. What they all of them desire with a like ardour is the old centralized and Caesarian regime, the state directing everything, ordaining everything, absorbing everything, regulating the smallest details of the life of the citizens, and thus freeing them from the necessity of displaying the least glimmer of reflection and initiative. Whether the authority placed at the head of the state is called king, emperor, president, etc., is of no importance. This authority, whatever it be, will perforce have the same ideal, and this ideal is the same expression of the sentiments of the soul of the race. Footnote, quote, "Such," unquote, writes a highly judicious observer, Dupont White, quote, "is the singular genius of France. The character of the people precludes its succeeding in certain matters, either essential or desirable, which bear on the ornamental or fundamental side of civilization, unless it be sustained or stimulated in the enterprise by its government," unquote. End of footnote. And the race would tolerate no other. While then our extreme excitability, the extreme ease with which we become discontented with our surroundings, the idea that a new government will render our lot happier, lead us to be always changing our institutions, the mighty voice of the dead which guides us condemns us to change but words and appearances. The unconscious power of the soul of our race is such that we do not even perceive the illusion of which we are the victims. Nothing assuredly, if only appearances be considered, is more different from the old regime than the regime created by the Great Revolution. In reality, however, the Revolution, though doubtless unawares, did no more than continue the monarchical tradition by completing the work of centralization begun by the monarchy centuries previously. Were Louis XIII and Louis XIV to rise from their tombs to judge the work of the Revolution, they would doubtless blame some of the acts of violence which accompanied its realization, but they would consider it to be in rigorous conformity with their tradition and their programme. and they would allow that a minister entrusted with the execution of this program could not have carried it out more successfully. They would declare that the least revolutionary government France has known was precisely that of the Revolution. They would further note that none of the various regimes that have succeeded one another in France for a century past has attempted to tamper with this work, so entirely is it the fruit of a regular evolution, the continuation of the monarchical ideal and the expression of the genius of the race. Doubtless these illustrious phantoms, in consequence of their great experience, would offer some criticisms, would perhaps remark, for example, that the substitution of an administrative caste for the aristocratic governing caste has created in the state an impersonal power that is more redoubtable than the old nobility, since it is the sole power which, being untouched by political changes, is in possession of traditions and of an esprit de corps, while it is irresponsible and perpetual, conditions which necessarily lead to its becoming the sole master. However, they would not dwell, I fancy, to any great extent on this objection, for they would be mindful of the fact that the Latin peoples care very little for liberty, but a great deal for equality, and put up with all despotisms without difficulty, provided they be impersonal. Perhaps, too, they would consider excessive and very tyrannical the innumerable regulations, the 1,001 obligations, which surround at the present day the most insignificant acts of existence, and they would perhaps observe that when the state has absorbed everything, regulated everything, and despoiled the citizens of all initiative, we shall find ourselves spontaneously and without any fresh revolution involved in out-and-out socialism. But at this stage of their reflection, the divine perspicacity that enlightens kings, or, in its absence, the mathematical principle that effects increase in geometrical progression when their causes subsist, will allow them to perceive that socialism is nothing else than the ultimate expression of the monarchical idea, of which the revolution was merely an accelerative phase. Thus it is that, in the institutions of a people, we meet both with those accidental circumstances referred to in the beginning of this work, and those permanent laws which we have attempted to determine. The accidental circumstances give rise to the names and appearances. The fundamental laws, and the most fundamental of them arise from the character of peoples, create the destiny of nations. With the preceding example we may contrast that of another race, the English race, whose psychological constitution is very different from our own. Merely in consequence of this fact, its constitutions are radically distinct from ours. Whether the English have at their head a monarch as in England, or a president as in the United States, their government will always present the same fundamental characteristics. The action of the state will be reduced to a minimum, and that of private individuals carried to a maximum. A state of things which is the precise contrary of the Latin ideal. Harbours, canals, railways, educational establishments, etc. will always be created and kept up by the initiative of private individuals and never by that of the state. Footnote. This preponderance of individual initiative should more especially be observed in America. It has singularly decreased in the last 25 years in England, where the encroachments of the state are becoming more and more marked. End of footnote. There are no revolutions, constitutions, or despots that can give to a people which does not possess them, or take from a people which does possess them, the qualities of character of which its institutions are the outcome. It has often been said that peoples have the governments they deserve. Is it conceivable that it should be otherwise? We shall soon show by other examples that a people does not escape the consequences of its mental constitution, or that if it throws off this influence it is only for a brief moment, as the sand swept up by a storm seems for an instant to be rebellious to the laws of attraction. It is a childish chimera to believe that governments and constitutions count for anything in the destinies of a people. The destiny of a people lies in itself, and not in exterior circumstances. All that can be asked of a government is that it shall be the expression of the sentiments and ideas of the people it is called on to govern, and by the mere fact that it exists, it is the image of the people. There are no governments or constitutions of which it can be said that they are absolutely good or absolutely bad. The government of the King of Dahomey was probably an excellent government for the people he was called on to rule over, and the most ingenious European constitution would have been inferior for his people. This truth is unfortunately ignored by statesmen who imagine that a mode of government can be exported and that colonies can be governed with the institutions of a metropolis, it would be as futile to wish to persuade fish to live in the air, under the pretext that aerial respiration is practised by all the superior animals. By the mere fact of the diversity of their mental constitution, different peoples cannot long exist under an identical regime. The Irish and the English, the Slav and the Hungarian, the Arab and the Frenchman, are only maintained with the utmost difficulty under the same laws and at the cost of incessant revolutions. Great empires embracing diverse peoples have always been condemned to an ephemeral existence, when they have endured for some length of time, as the Mongolian Empire did, or as that of the English in India has done. It is on the one hand because the races in contact were so numerous, so different, and in consequence separated by such rivalries that it was impossible that they should unite against the foreigner. And it was on the other hand because these foreign masters have had a sufficiently sure political instinct to respect the customs of the conquered peoples and to allow them to live under their own laws. Many books would have to be written, indeed, history would have to be entirely recast and considered from quite a new standpoint, if it were desired to show all the consequences of the psychological constitution of peoples. A close study of this constitution ought to be the basis of politics and education. It might even be said that this study would avert many errors and many upheavals, if peoples could escape the fatalities of their race, if the voice of reason were not always extinguished by the imperious voice of the dead. End of section 9.